and welcome back to our first lesson from Chapter 17, The Conflict Takes Shape. And this is what we have been building towards in the last few months with all of the discussions about slavery and the era of good feelings and whether slavery should be allowed in the territories or whether states should be allowed to secede or be able to act independently of each other. This is what we've been building towards, this watershed moment in American history. So as we go through today's lesson, we're going to not look really at the battles per se, but we're going to talk about the strengths of the North and the strengths of the South at the beginning of the conflict and how each side really justified why they were fighting and what they were fighting for. So like any conflict, each side has its own strengths and weaknesses, and so today we're going to be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the North as well as the strengths and weaknesses of the South. And as we do that, I have a chart that you can use here, and it as we go through today's lesson, I've given you either a rich text version or a PDF version, or you can create your own. There are 12 blocks within this chart. So on one side you have the United States of America, or think of that as the Union or the North, and on the other side the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy, the South. So the president of each, the number of states in the Union, the number of states in the Confederacy, the population of each, the reasons they gave for fighting, the economy of each, whether it was based on agriculture or based on manufacturing, the Army and Navy, the strength of each, as well as whether each side had strong or weak military leaders. And with that particular section, I'm looking more at the generals, because there was one side that definitely had an advantage when it came to military leadership. So you can print this chart out or, like I said, create your own. But as we go through today's lesson, like, you may have to kind of bounce around filling this out, but you will be able to find all the answers. And keep this with you because it's a very, very good study tool as we go through our future lessons about the Civil War, and it's good for us to remember the strengths and weaknesses that each side had as we progress through the war. Likewise, our key terms for today are border state and martial law, and we will get into those pretty early on, but we'll spend a lot of time talking about the border states, and you've been clued into that with the introductory lesson, but we'll get into that a little bit more as we go on. So remember, either print out the chart or create your own, but remember to have all of those sections. You have a couple of different options for how you will submit that at the end, but we'll get to that at the very end of the lesson today. All right, on to the Civil War.
The country was coming apart. In the presidential election of 1860, Buchanan happily stepped aside, but not before his ruling Democratic Party was fatally split over the issue of slavery. The Republicans, a new party, saw their chance and nominated Abraham Lincoln, a moderate. His platform pledged only to halt slavery's further spread.
On that point hold firm as with a chain of steel. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it.
Radical abolitionists in the North complained that Lincoln's opposition to slavery did not go far enough. But to most people in the South, the prospect of Lincoln's election posed a lethal threat. The 1860 campaign had become a referendum on the Southern way of life. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with only 40% of the vote. He did not even appear on the ballot in 10 Southern states.
The election of Mr. Lincoln is undoubtedly the greatest evil that has ever befallen this country. But the mischief is done, and the only relief for the American people is to shorten sail, send down the topmasts, and prepare for a hurricane. Richmond Whig.
In the South, Lincoln was burned in effigy, and now the South Carolina legislature called for a convention to consider seceding from the Union.
Southerners would have told you they were fighting for self-government. They believed that the gathering of power in Washington was against them. When they entered into that federation, they certainly would never have entered into it if they hadn't believed it'd be possible to get out. And when the time came that they wanted to get out, they thought they had every right. Southerners saw the election of Lincoln as a sign that the Union was about to be radicalized and that they were about to be taken in directions they did not care to go. The abolitionist aspect of it was very strong, and they figured they were about to lose what they call their property and faced ruin.
Yet many Southerners thought secession was madness. South Carolina, one Southern politician wrote, is too small for a republic and too large for an insane asylum.
Each side was convinced at the beginning and throughout the war that it was justified in fighting, that it had a very good reason for fighting, and that the reason that it had was enough to continue the fight all the way to the end. The South believed that they had every right to leave the Union, but the North looked at Southern secession as just a petty rebellion, so they fought to preserve the Union. Now, I've said this about a previous war. So if that one side seeing this as a right to leave and start their own country, while the other side seeing it as a petty rebellion, if that sounds familiar, that's kind of the same mindset that we as colonists had at the time of the American Revolution. For the South, they didn't see this as a civil war or as a war between members of the same country. They saw this as a war for their own independence and referred to it as the War for Southern Independence. And at this point in our country's history, it hadn't even been 100 years since the original War for Independence from England. So just like those patriots about 100 years prior, the Southerners saw this new war as a way to preserve their way of life, and included with that was keeping slavery alive. In the North, this was also a war to preserve a way of life, but that way of life was the United States of America. The issue of slavery and freeing the slaves really didn't matter to most Northerners at first, because many still felt that slavery didn't need to be fully abolished. A lot of them wanted to stop its spread, but felt like if the South wants to keep slavery going, that's up to them. Otherwise, we don't want it to spread, but what we're really fighting for is to preserve the Union and to keep the country intact. Many, like I said, many still felt that it didn't fully need to be abolished. Racism was just as prevalent then as it is now, and even more so. And even today in America, racism can still be found in the North, just as it can be found in the South. But that's back to the Civil War. In April of 1861, 8 slave states still belonged to the Union. But with the official start of the Civil War, they needed to decide whether to stay with the Union or to join the Confederacy. And we're looking at a map right now that shows the states that seceded before the fall of Fort Sumter. Those are the blue states. The red states are the ones that stayed loyal to the Union. And then in between, we have these 8 border states where slavery still existed, but they weren't 100% sure whether to stay with the Union or to join the South. So 4 of the states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, decided to join the Confederacy, while the other 4 border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, stayed in the Union. And what's important about these 8 states is that combined, these 8 states contained about half the free population of the South, as well as most of the food crops. So if all 8 states had joined, this may have led to a very different outcome for the war. And Maryland's decision to stay with the Union was exceptionally important because bordering Maryland is Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Some of the citizens of these border states, even though the state itself stayed with the Union, some of the citizens were loyal to the South, and especially in Baltimore, Maryland, pro-South mobs rioted, so President Lincoln was forced to declare martial law to try and keep the peace. And martial law is ruled by the army instead of the elected government. And this issue of Baltimore staying loyal to the South is going to come up in the very near future, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So I want you to try and put yourself in the position of somebody living in one of these border states. How do you think you would have reacted? Honestly, I think it would be hard to try and choose a side if I lived in a state that was divided like that. For instance, let's take the state of Virginia. In that state, not everyone agreed with the decision to join the South, so part of the state actually split apart from Virginia to form their own state of West Virginia, which sided with the North. So if you ever wondered why there are 2 Virginias, this is why.
When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, there were 33 states in the Union, and a 34th, Free Kansas, was about to join. By the time of his inauguration, 5 months later, just 27 states would remain. The suddenness of secession took everyone by surprise. South Carolina led the way on December 20th. A bell in Charleston tolled the succession of departing states. Mississippi on January 9th. Florida on the 10th. Then Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. In Texas, Governor Sam Houston was deposed when he tried to stop his state from joining the Confederacy.
Let me tell you what is coming. After the sacrifice of countless millions of treasure and hundreds of thousands of lives, you may win Southern independence. But I doubt it. The North is determined to preserve this Union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people as you are, for they live in colder climates. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the steady momentum and perseverance of a mighty avalanche.
Texas left anyway. Even Virginia, the most populous southern state, birthplace of 7 presidents, seemed sure to follow.
All the indications are that this treasonable inflammation, secessionitis, keeps on making steady progress, week by week. If disunion becomes an established fact, we have one consolation. The self-amputated members were diseased beyond immediate cure, and their virus will infect our system no longer. George Templeton Strong.
The Charleston Mercury. The tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated.
So both sides had their reasons for fighting. The South, it was to preserve their way of life and for states' rights and the right to keep slaves. In the North, it was also to preserve their way of life, but like I said, that way of life was as the United States, so to preserve the Union. So now let's kind of shift our focus to the strengths and weaknesses that each side had at the beginning of the war. Now, they both had their strengths, but they also had pretty glaring weaknesses. So for the South, their greatest strength was the same greatest strength that the colonies had in the War for Independence: defense. The South was fighting a defensive war. They didn't need to conquer the North. They just wanted to keep fighting until the North decided to stop fighting and give up and leave them alone. The same way that the colonies didn't need to conquer England, they just needed to keep the fight going long enough for England to say, you know what, I've had it, go ahead and be your own country. That's the same kind of mindset that the South had for the Civil War. We don't need to conquer the North, we just need to keep the fight going long enough for the North to just give up and say, go ahead and be your own Confederate States of America. The South really just wanted to become its own separate country and to have the North agree to that. They felt justified in doing so because it was almost exactly the same as what the colonists had done when we broke away from England. Now, the North had an advantage. They had better supply lines, a much larger fighting force, and better manufacturing at its advantage, but the South simply had to play defense and wait for the North to give up. Now let's look at some of these strengths and weaknesses of the South in a little bit more detail. So the South had their personal reasons for fighting because they were defending their homeland, they were defending their way of life, but they also had some tactical advantages. Like I said, the Confederate soldiers were fighting on their home turf, so they knew the layout of the land much, much better than the Union soldiers. And it's easier to defend an area if you know where to go and where not to go. For instance, what we're looking at right now is one of the, quote, battlefields of Chancellorsville, Virginia. So if you don't know where to go, it's a good chance that if you decide to try and fight in a swamp that you're putting yourself at a very tactical disadvantage. So the Confederate soldiers and the Confederate generals knew where to fight and where not to fight. The soldiers knew the many wooded areas of the South, so they had that advantage by knowing the terrain, but they also had the support of the locals. Many Southern civilians helped the soldiers and helped them along back roads that weren't on any maps. So tactically, they had the advantage of knowing where to fight, where not to fight, and they knew the terrain and had the help of the civilians. But on the flip side, they had the advantage knowing the terrain, but they also had a lot of disadvantages that plagued them throughout the war. For instance, the economy of the South, as we've discussed in previous lessons, was based on agriculture, not manufacturing. So there wasn't a lot of industrial centers to take advantage of them. Most of the industrial centers were in the North because the economy there was built on manufacturing. So that left the South with very few factories to produce weapons and ammunition, and very few railroads to move those supplies or move the troops. So they had a much smaller fighting force, and they didn't have a lot of factories to produce weapons and ammunition. So tactically, they knew the terrain, they were playing defense, they had the help of the locals, but on the other side, they had a much smaller fighting force, and they didn't have a lot of factories to be able to produce weapons and munitions. So, strengths and weaknesses of the South. Let's move on to some of the strengths and weaknesses that the North had. So, as far as free citizens go, the North had almost 4 times the amount of free citizens as the South. So that made for a very large pool for volunteers and a very large fighting force. And before the war, the North produced about 90% of the nation's industrial products. So after the war began, a lot of those factories were very quickly converted to making guns, ammunitions, boots, uniforms, etc., for the Union Army. And also, about 70% of the nation's railway lines ran through the North, so transportation of these goods, as well as this very large fighting force, was much easier than it was in the South. The North also had a very strong navy, which made the South almost unable to compete at sea. So, very large fighting force, huge industrial centers, and a very large and very strong navy. But despite those advantages, the North didn't have an easy task ahead of them. They couldn't just walk into the South and expect surrender. The Southerners were defending their homes, and they knew the land, while the Northern Army didn't. Also, those supply lines were very, very long and were very open to attack by Southern forces. And honestly, the biggest disadvantage was that the South was fighting to defend their homes and fighting on their home turf. It's much harder to conquer an opponent when you're fighting on their home turf. And our next video is going to go into a little bit more detail about these advantages and disadvantages that each side had at the beginning of the war.
The North had a population of 22 million and contained most of the country's factories, whereas the South was basically agricultural and had a population of 9 million people, of which nearly 4 million were slaves. It might seem that the odds against the South were impossible, and yet Southerners were great fighters, led by brilliant generals, such as Robert E. Lee. And during the first year of the Civil War, the Union troops were rarely successful in beating the rebel armies.
So if the South was outmanned, outgunned, and out everything else, not a word, but you get my point, how were they able to maintain such a long war? Well, like this quote says, everything rises and falls on leadership. Everything depends on leadership, and the South was definitely at the advantage when it came to military leadership. Between the two presidents, even President Abraham Lincoln of the United States and President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy, Davis had the military background, but Lincoln would prove to be a fine war planner himself. Now, a little bit more about Jefferson Davis. Davis had been educated at West Point, served in the Mexican War, and has also served as Secretary of War for President Franklin Pierce. Davis knew war, and he knew what it took to win. But because of this, he was unwilling to turn over much of the control of the military to his advisors and would spend hours and hours on the smallest details. On the flip side, Lincoln didn't have a lot of experience in either the military or even in politics, but he proved that he was a very patient and fine leader, and he was able to gather people around him. This is something that plagued him throughout the war, was finding competent leadership, but he was patient. So that was really his biggest quality when it came to military leadership. Davis had all of the experience, but he was unwilling to give up a lot of the leadership to his advisors. Lincoln didn't have a lot of people around him, but he was very patient. But politically, the government of the South had many of the same problems that the United States had under the Articles of Confederation. The emphasis of the Confederacy was on states' rights, so cooperating to get things done was very, very difficult. Also, the South had less than half the population of the North. The population of the South was about 9 million versus the North's 22 million, and about a third of that 9 million was slaves. So you're looking at about 6 million free Southerners versus 22 million free Northerners. So finding potential soldiers in a much smaller pool to take from, and no soldiers equals no army. But like I said, where the South really had their biggest advantage was their military leaders. Many of the country's best officers, best generals, were Southerners. And when the Confederacy split away, they joined the Confederacy. So Lincoln had a very, very tough time finding competent leaders throughout the war that could really match the leadership of the South. And among the most intelligent and most respected of all generals in American history is Robert E. Lee. Now, Lee had graduated with honors from West Point and served on the Army Corps of Engineers. And he had been noted by a superior officer during the Mexican War as being, quote, the very best soldier I have ever seen. But despite that, Lee actually hated war. And with the onset of the Civil War, he had to make a choice to either side with the Union or side with his home state of Virginia. And Lincoln even asked him personally to be commander of the Union forces, but in the end, Lee chose to remain loyal to his home state. And in a letter, Lee stated his intentions. If Virginia stands by the Union, then so will I. But if she secedes, then I will follow my native state with my sword, and if need be, my life. General Robert E. Lee.
During the 4 years it was fought, it went by many names. The War for States' Rights, Mr. Lincoln's War, the War for Southern Nationality, the War for Separation, the War for Union, the War between the states, the Second War of Independence, the Brothers' War, the Lost Cause. To historians, it became known as the American Civil War, the Civil War for short. For 100 years later, the Civil War remains the deadliest war ever launched in the Western Hemisphere. It was also one of history's most divisive and disastrous conflicts, tearing a nation apart and pitting brother against brother. A house divided against itself, Abraham Lincoln said, cannot stand. Yet between 1861 and 1865, the American home literally was split in two, and the country torn apart. Americans fought Americans. The lines were drawn roughly between North and South, but conflicting loyalties blurred apparently clear distinctions. Men from the North bid their families farewell and donned Confederate uniforms, convinced that states' rights were endangered by the Lincoln administration. Men from Dixie kissed their mothers goodbye and headed north to join the Union forces, convinced that black slavery could only be removed by force. Even the president himself experienced the war's terrible pull of loyalties. 4 of Lincoln's brothers-in-law enlisted with the Confederates. And the president watched as states such as Kentucky and Delaware contributed equal numbers of willing recruits to both sides.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. The essential question from today's lesson implies that just like previous wars we discussed, French and Indian War, the Revolution, War of 1812, there were advantages and disadvantages for both sides. The North was bigger and had a much bigger population, but the South had better military leadership and they were fighting on their home turf. So using that chart that I gave you at the very, very beginning of the lesson, and any outside resources that you may have come across, I want you to decide which side had the best advantages and which side had the worst disadvantages. So if you feel that the South had the best advantages towards the North's disadvantages, I want you to back up your statements using details from the text, videos, lesson whatever. So if you decide that the South had the best advantages, tell me why. Or if you felt that the North's advantages were superior to the South, tell me why. This first part is going to be worth 10 points. But the second part, it's one thing to have an advantage, but it's another to have a reason to fight. Which side had more to gain from winning the Civil War, and which side had more to lose? So, again, using that information that you've compiled, in a paragraph, I want you to describe which side had the most to fight for, the most to gain, and the most to lose, and how that might play into the advantages and disadvantages that you described from the previous section. So, two things. First, which side had the biggest advantages and why? And then secondly, which side had the most to gain from winning the war and why? So, whichever side you choose, I'm not looking for, if you choose this side, I think that's the best, and this side is it's the worst. I want you to tell me why, because both sides had reasons for fighting, both sides had advantages, both sides had disadvantages. Which one had the best advantages, and which one had the most to gain from winning the war? All right? If you have any questions, please come and find me. Otherwise, good luck, and I look forward to reading your essays. And have a great rest of your day.